us, now preaches the faith. In Philippians chapter 3, verse 6, concerning zeal, I persecuted the church. And the last reference is in 1 Timothy 1, verse 13, I was formerly a blasphemer and a persecutor and an insolent man. 6 of those references all use the word persecuted, persecuted, persecuted. And then adds to it the other things of putting people in chains and putting them in prison and all the rest of it that goes with it. I have a feeling that for the rest of his life, Paul lived with the reality of what he had done. Did it in all good conscience, he says, but it was wrong. It wasn't the way God intended for him to live, and it took him a while to learn there's another way to go, and he had to turn around. In this lesson in our book, Chad Ramsey writes these lessons. Chad begins by making some statements about the role of persecution in the first century church. Jesus had already warned the apostles this was going to happen. He didn't want them to go into the coming of the church with a kind of rose-colored glasses that everything's going to be wonderful, you don't have anything to worry about. He says you're going to have a lot to worry about. For example, Chad quotes from John chapter 16. This is on page 2. Indeed, the hour is coming, yes, has now come, that you will be scattered, each to his own, and will leave me alone, and yet I'm not alone, because the Father is with me. These things I've spoken to you, that in me you may have peace. In the world you will have tribulation, but be of good cheer, I've overcome the world. You will have tribulation. He'd already taught them in the Sermon on the Mount that blessed are you when men revile you and persecute you and say all manner of evil against you falsely for my sake. Rejoice and be exceedingly glad, because they persecuted the prophets. And then Chad quotes Matthew chapter 10. Beware of men, for they will deliver you up to councils and scourge you in their synagogues. You will be brought before governors and kings for my sake, as a testimony to them and to the Gentiles. And so when we start talking about Paul the persecutor, which is the topic for this lesson, we have to recognize that he's falling right into a pattern that the Lord said would come. It's going to happen. And at the end of his life, Paul will look back on all of this and say, all that will live godly in Christ Jesus will suffer persecution. It's just inevitable. It will occur. You will experience it. Now, how do you handle it? Frequently, as we began reading the letters in the New Testament, and Scott Sager has mentioned this in connection with the 7 churches of Asia, one of the things that we read, if not directly in the lines, then between the lines in those letters, is preparing the people to endure the persecutions that will come. Things will not be easy. There will be opposition. Or as Paul said, I wanted to destroy the church. I mentioned last week, let's think about the motivation for Saul of Tarsus. What caused all of this? Here was a man who was deeply committed to the law of Moses, deeply committed to its principles, to its practices, and who was convinced that anything that came along that looked like it was contrary to the law of Moses needed to be done away with. There's no place in this world for the law of Moses and its opposition. And so Paul's assumption was, I have to oppose it, I have to destroy it, I have to remove it. I think his motivation was good in the sense of his own background, but he wasn't open to the possibility that something may have changed here. And the very thing that the prophets had warned about and talked about, there is one coming. Even Moses himself long ago had said, the Lord will raise up a prophet like unto me. That's what's so significant at the Mount of Transfiguration, when Jesus appears with Moses and Elijah, and God said, listen to him. You listen to Moses. You listen to Elijah. You listen to all the prophets. But now listen to him. It's time to hear a new voice. It's time to learn a new law. It's time now to discover a new way to worship. All of that was going to be very significant for what Paul had to say. Well, as we begin this study about Paul himself, it's almost interesting that Paul just suddenly appears on the scene. We've been reading the four Gospels, and we've learned a lot about Jesus. We've learned a lot about the 12 apostles. And then we start the book of Acts, and just all of a sudden, here's a man named Saul. Where did he come from? Who was he? Well, we talked briefly last week that Saul was a Benjamite, in all likelihood named for their good king Saul, who was also a Benjamite. He comes from Tarsus, but apparently his parents moved to Jerusalem at some point to give him an opportunity to study under Gamaliel, one of the great teachers of the day. We encounter Gamaliel in the book of Acts once when he speaks up at a meeting of the Sanhedrin. So Saul comes along with a lot of good opportunities. He is a Roman citizen in addition to being a Hebrew. He shares a dual citizenship. That sets him apart from a lot of people. But he just suddenly appears. Well, there are four early references to Saul's appearance, and some of them are a part of our text for tonight, and some are not. The first time Saul is mentioned in the Bible occurs in Acts chapter 7, verse 58. The witnesses laid down their clothes at the feet of a young man named Saul. Just suddenly, there he is. He's a part of the crowd there stoning Stephen. Why was Stephen being stoned? What's brought about all of this? Well, we recognize Stephen as being one of those 7 men who were appointed to take care of the Grecian widows against the charges that they were being neglected. Stephen went on to be much more forthright, and he preaches to the people a powerful sermon that is one of the great summations of the Old Testament. You read Stephen's sermon and you got a good grip. I don't know whether it's appropriate to say that it's the Cliff Notes of the Old Testament, but it's the Reader's Digest version at least. It's a grand summary of the Old Testament. And the people were so incensed they rose up and stoned him. And some of them laid their clothes down at the feet of a young man. You and I both know that when the word young is used in the Bible, we know what that means. Young can be anywhere from really young to old, but a young man, likely young. The best estimates are that Saul was probably born shortly after Jesus came into the world. Younger than Jesus, but still a young man. And I speculated last week in talking about him as a young man that it's possible that was one of the reasons he himself gathered young men around him to serve as their mentor, to encourage them in the church. And we think about people like Titus and Timothy and John Mark and Epaphras and others of those people who kind of gathered around Saul and accompanied him on mission journeys. Second reference to Saul comes in chapter 8, verse 1. Now Saul was consenting to Stephen's death. We've moved a little farther than just holding the clothes. Now it's as if votes were cast. He voted for it. He was consenting. He approved of what was taking place. He didn't stand back and say, wait a minute, let's think about this, folks. He was consenting to his death. 2 verses later in Acts chapter 8, Luke writes, as for Saul, he made havoc of the church, entering every household and dragging off men and women and committing them to prison. He's getting bolder. Language is strong. He made havoc of the church. Did everything he could to destroy it, to disrupt it, to disturb it. And words like he entered every household, just walked in and grabbed people, dragging off men and women and putting them in prison. And then the last reference comes as a part of our text for tonight, chapter 9, verse 1. Then Saul, still breathing threats and murder against the disciples of the Lord. One of the times when I was reading those verses about Saul and those early statements about him, I couldn't help thinking his actions kind of fit the pattern that we find in Psalm 1. Blessed is the man who walks not in the counsel of the ungodly, nor stands in the way of sinners, nor sits in the seat of the scornful. And those 3 verbs are kind of interesting. Walk, stand, sit. I just become a little more acclimated. I become a little more adjusting to it. And so with Saul, we find him fitting that pattern because he held garments, he consented, he participated, and then he stretched his borders by going to Damascus. One commentator says about him in this period of his life, he was more like a wild beast than a man. It was as if he had lost much of his senses. He had lost his control. He was just going to do whatever it took to wipe out the church. Well, then we have our lesson for tonight. His first confrontation with Jesus. We noticed last week that this story is told 4 times in the New Testament. It is told in Acts chapter 9, Acts 22, Acts 26, and Galatians 1. 4 times Paul tells people about his conversion, the details that went with it, the experiences he had, and the people who were involved with him. So let's look at our text. From Acts chapter 8, verse 1, Saul was consenting to his death. At that time, a great persecution arose against the church, which was at Jerusalem, and they were all scattered throughout the regions of Judea and Samaria, except the apostles. Just as the gospel began in Jerusalem, so persecution began in Jerusalem. You would expect it to be there. That's the hotbed of Christianity. As the gospel was spread, so did the persecution. It's interesting that Jesus says to the apostles just before he ascends, you're going to be my witnesses in Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, and the uttermost parts of the earth. Where do we talk about persecution here? Persecution was in Jerusalem and Judea and Samaria. All 3 places mentioned in that single verse. The effects of persecution, personally, they were dangerous. Congregationally, they could be destructive. Evangelistically, the people who were scattered went everywhere preaching. If they were forced to leave Jerusalem, they took the gospel with them. If they were forced to leave Judea, they took the gospel with them. Forced to leave Samaria, took the gospel with them. And as we read a little bit later in the book of Acts, the church grew and multiplied. In the midst of all the opposition, in the midst of all the dangers, in the midst of all the fury, the gospel grew, the church grew, conversions occurred. In the second part of this lesson, picking up at chapter 9, I've used the title, Paul Makes It Personal. And I'll make some comments about that. Look at verses 1 and 2 of chapter 9. Then Saul, still breathing threats and murder against the disciples of the Lord, went to the high priest and asked letters from him to the synagogues of Damascus, so that if he found any who were of the way, whether men or women, he might bring them bound to Jerusalem. 2 or 3 things there catch my attention. First place is the word still. Then Saul, still breathing threats and murder. He hadn't let up at all. If anything, it's intensified. We get threats and murder tied together. How many lives was he responsible for that were lost for the cause of Christ? Still breathing threats and murder against the disciples of the Lord, took the initiative to go to the high priest. Notice he did not go to a Roman official. Roman officials had the right to dictate execution. But he went to the high priest because this affected their religion. The Romans didn't want anything to do with the religion. So he goes to the high priest and requests of him letters that would authorize him to go to Damascus and search the synagogues there. We've already learned that he was in the synagogues in Jerusalem. That's where the Jews were gathering. It's where they worshiped. So let's go to Damascus and we'll search the synagogues there. It's interesting, that's the pattern that Paul will later use in his evangelism. When he goes into a city, he goes first to the synagogue, introduces himself to the Jewish worshipers. And then when they reject him, as they did in Antioch of Pisidia, he says, because you rejected me, I will turn to the Gentiles. And he turned his attention there at the will of God. So he goes to the high priest and requests those letters of authorization. There were many of those people who had already fled Jerusalem. They'd gone to Damascus thinking they'd be safe. And here comes Saul looking for them there. Just as he had searched the synagogue in Jerusalem, now he's ready to search all of those synagogues in Damascus, which incidentally was about 150 miles from Jerusalem. That was no small journey to go from Jerusalem to Damascus. But he had a purpose. He was driven by a mission, and so he went. His intentions were to arrest anybody he found of the way, which is one of the ways the church is referred to in the book of Acts. And we think of Jesus saying, I am the way, the truth, and the life. If he found anybody of the way, then he could arrest them and bring them back to Jerusalem. And the sentence isn't finished, but we know what it really means is he intends to punish them, find them guilty, execute them possibly. So he makes it personal. It is Paul's own desire. It's his own drive. It's his own intention. This is what I'm going to do. And he does it. Nothing is said in the Bible about his having a whole body of people around him. It's just Saul, Saul, Saul. And so he pursues. And then we have that amazing experience. Rises above many other experiences in the Bible. It is of such note. Again, Paul will tell us about it 3 times in the Acts accounts. His meeting with Jesus. Picking up at verse 3. As he journeyed, however long that took to make those 150 miles, he came near Damascus, and suddenly a light shone around him from heaven. Then he fell to the ground and heard a voice saying to him, Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me? And he said, Who are you, Lord? Then the Lord said, I am Jesus, whom you are persecuting. It's hard for you to kick against the goads. So he, trembling and astonished, said, Lord, what do you want me to do? And the Lord said to him, Arise and go into the city, and you'll be told what you must do. And the men who journeyed with him, the first time we've had a reference to people being with him, the men who journeyed with him stood speechless, hearing a voice, but seeing no one. Then Saul arose from the ground, and when his eyes were opened, he saw no one. But they led him by the hand and brought him into Damascus. Saul had his plan in mind. He knew exactly what he was going to do, and he was going to follow it. But Jesus had another plan. Jesus said, I'm going to confront him on the road, and then we'll see what happens. This experience begins with light. Suddenly a great light shone. And we think of John saying Jesus was the light that came into the world. He talked about the fact that the darkness could never understand it or conquer it. First, there was a great light. And that brightness brought Saul immediately to the ground. So bright, he couldn't stand it. And he fell to the ground. And then there was a voice. Saul, Saul. I've often thought, and I've said this sometimes in lessons, there are a few times in the Bible when a person is addressed and his name appears twice. And it's like the Lord is saying, I mean it, you. It's Saul, Saul. In the Old Testament, we have Samuel, Samuel. In Luke 10, we have Mary, Mary. In Luke 22, we have Jesus saying, Simon, Simon. It's kind of like a frustrated mama who calls her child the same name twice just to be sure he hears. It's the Lord's way of saying, I want your attention. He doesn't just say Saul. Saul, Saul. Why are you persecuting me? Just as we said Saul made it personal, Jesus makes it personal, very personal. Why are you persecuting me? It is Paul who's going to make such a point in his letters that the church is the body of Christ. And so when Paul persecutes the church, or when Saul persecutes the church, he's persecuting Jesus. He's persecuting his body. And so Jesus asked legitimately, why are you persecuting me? They kind of swap out questions here. Why are you persecuting me? Who are you, Lord? I am Jesus, whom you are persecuting. Saul had probably heard a lot about Jesus. He had probably said a lot of things about Jesus. But this is his first introduction. This is why he will say later in 1 Corinthians, as he describes his call to the apostleship, that he was an apostle born out of due time. He didn't come like the other apostles. His was a very special calling. And he came when he met the Lord on the road to Damascus. I am Jesus whom you're persecuting. What do you want, Lord? It's interesting that Jesus doesn't tell him anything there except go into the city and you'll be told. Just finish your journey. You started at Damascus, go on. And Saul got up and continued the journey. It's interesting to notice the reactions of the men with him. They heard a voice, but they couldn't see anything. Who's he talking to? And then when they helped him get up off the ground, they discovered something else really interesting. He was blind. Oh, we can say, well, the light was so bright it hurt his eyes. No, he was blind. It's not the only time not the only time God uses some temporary limitation to get somebody's attention. I think of Miriam being attacked with leprosy, being attacked with leprosy. That got her attention and the attention of all the people around. I think of Zacharias, who was struck deaf. That got his attention, got the attention of everybody around him in the temple, got his family's attention, got the community's attention because he was deaf for nearly 9 months until John was born. And then here we have Saul, struck with blindness. And I mentioned last week that on his first mission journey, when he and Barnabas encounter Elymas, that man who tries to hinder their teaching, Paul kind of thinks, it worked with me, let's try with Elymas. He struck him blind. Let me let you know what it feels like, suddenly not to be able to see for several days. Using a short-term method to capture full attention. Pretty important. Well, it's a story we know well. It's not the first time you've heard it, the first time you've read it, first time you've thought about it. And you do wonder, why did Paul feel like he had to tell this over and over? I think it's because it hurt him to think what he had done. He was living with his past. And he had to explain how he was given such grand deliverance. No wonder he would talk about grace, because he experienced it. As we wrap up tonight, let me suggest 3 lessons that I think we may need to gain from this study. Number 1, all of us have to learn to live with our past. It may not be pleasant. It may not be the thing we're most proud of. But there are things in our past that we wish we hadn't done. Somehow we have to learn to live with that. We have to reconcile that with what Jesus has asked of us and what he offers us. Learn to live with my past. That's not easily done, but it needs to be done. Saul always thought he was right. He found out he was wrong, and he had to live with that. Number 2, when I choose to oppose someone or something, I need to be clear about whom I am opposing. Saul tackled a opposition to Jesus in the concept that he was defending the old law. He was going to understand later that that old law was gone. Jesus nailed it to the cross. I need to know whom I am opposing. Who am I talking against? Who am I fighting against? You go back to what apparently the Lord quotes as a kind of proverb in there. It's hard to kick against the pricks. The animal driver who had an ox goad, a sharpened stick, would use it to prod the oxen, move them on. It was hard to kick against that. It was too small a thing. They couldn't reach it. They just felt a sharp point and they kicked, but it wasn't there. But there was somebody getting their attention. Somebody's trying to get our attention too. And then number 3, I couldn't help thinking, this is another one of those on-the-road experiences in the Bible. There are those wonderful times when suddenly things happen, not in the big city, not in the family household. They're just on the road, somewhere out here in the middle of nowhere. Something happens that's going to be notable. I thought about those two people who met Jesus on the road to Emmaus. That's an on-the-road experience. So on the road and so meaningful, they turned around and went back to Jerusalem. Never quite forget what happened on that road. Or there is that on-the-road experience of the Ethiopian treasurer. On his way home, reading his Bible, maybe he had heard somebody lecture on Isaiah while he was there, and suddenly he encounters Philip. And he will never forget what happened to him on that road as he headed home to Ethiopia. And then later in the book of Acts, we're going to have the story of Paul on the road to Rome. And that was a momentous trip involving sea travel, terrible storms, the threat of death, losing the ship and all of its cargo, floundering in the sea until finally they got ashore of an island. But when he finally got to Italy, the Christians had come from Rome down to meet him, and they escorted him back to the city. That was a long on-the-road experience, but it was good. What I'm suggesting in all that is that there are things that are going to be meaningful to us, that happen to us, and they're so out of the ordinary, we don't always grasp their significance until we look back on them and realize that was a major change for me. Thanks for being in our class tonight. We'll continue our study next week. We're going to look at lesson 2 in the book, and we'll be talking about Paul the convert. Thank you very much, and thank you.